The crystal chandelier hummed with light, bright enough to make the silver sparkle and the lies look clean. China whispered against linen as servers cleared plates, and my father rose at the head of the table with the same certainty he used to close deals. His glass lifted amber, catching the glow, and every back straightened, as if an invisible string jerked us up by the spine. I pressed my thumb along the rim of my wineglass and listened for the hairline crack I already felt inside my chest. "Family," he said, smiling the way a judge smiles before a verdict. "Tonight, we secure our legacy." Thomas tipped his chin toward me, a smirk tucked at the corner of his mouth. Victoria's bracelets chimed like tiny bells. Lucas stared at his phone until Stephanie nudged him to attention. Then my father turned, and in the same voice he used on hostile competitors, he said, "Edith, effective immediately. You're disinherited." Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, because I know some of you have sat at a table like this. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit that like button, share this with someone who'll understand, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes after this night. To understand how that sentence landed, you need to know what used to live in the empty space his words carved out. I was raised under high ceilings and stricter expectations in a Connecticut estate where the hedges were trimmed to match the family photo. Dad called it discipline. Mom called it stewardship. I learned early that both could look the same from a distance and feel very different up close. He built Thompson Real Estate out of thin air and steel beams, and he taught us that weakness belonged to other families. Mom taught me something softer and harder at once. Your name is what your choices make of it, not the other way around. She kept a light on in her reading room past midnight, a pool of gold where books lay open and a teacup cooled on an oak coaster. And when the house slept, mean her light never did. By the time I left for New York, I'd already memorized the family roles like a chart on a boardroom wall. Thomas, firstborn, wore Dad's approval like a tailored suit and borrowed confidence from other people's work. Victoria perfected the pause between compliments long enough for you to wonder what it would cost to keep her happy. Lucas arrived last and learned to float on cushions the rest of us arranged. I learned to let silence carry more weight than apologies, and I took my degree and my stubbornness to a career where results mattered more than last names. Mom passed 5 Christmases ago, and the house forgot how to breathe. Grief made Dad's edges sharper and his voice smaller, though he hid the second part from almost everyone. On holidays, Teresa would touch my elbow when she refilled my water and say, "Eat, mija," and that was sometimes the only kindness that reached the table. Without Mom, the family calendar kept moving, but the clock in that reading room seemed to stop. Dust didn't dare settle there, but we did on roles that fit worse every year. I came home that December because absence doesn't always buy you peace. Snow was falling in a slow, steady way that made the world look honest. The driveway stones clicked beneath the tires like a metronome. The lanterns along the hedges threw warm circles of light that didn't touch the cold. Teresa opened the door before I could knock, and I swore I smelled my mother's tea for a heartbeat before it turned back into winter air. "Miss Edith?" she said, pulling me into a hug that lasted 1 second longer than propriety. "You look tired." "Just city tired," I said, which was easier than telling her I'd learned to sleep with my jaw clenched. The house was dressed to impress a staged home for a family we never were. Ribbons laddered the banister, a 15-foot tree brushed the coffered ceiling, and presents sat in tidy pyramids like they'd been arranged by a magazine editor. Thomas arrived early with Stephanie and their children smiling like a press release. Victoria's heels clicked across marble as she announced herself to the room. Lucas wandered in late a day behind the rest of us, eyes rimmed and coat unbuttoned. Dad stayed in his study until 5:30 on the dot, then joined us with his tie perfectly centered and a look that said the evening would go his way. We sat where years had told us to sit. The roast was cooked to that exact medium Dad likes, the one he swears proves attention to detail. Conversation skimmed along safe surfaces, schools, ski trips, a charity gala, where Victoria served on a committee by signing her name. Whenever my work came up, the table changed the subject the way you close a door gently on a room you don't plan to enter. I'd gotten used to it. Habits form grooves, and families keep running in them until someone trips. I was done lifting my foot. Dad stood again, and the chandelier laid a careful halo over his silver hair. Family, he repeated, and the word meant shareholders more than people. This next year brings adjustments some of you may find clarifying. Thomas leaned back like a man about to watch his own victory speech. Victoria watched her reflection in her spoon. Lucas scratched the label off his water bottle and didn't look up. I folded my napkin across my lap and kept my breathing even. Dad's eyes found mine the way a hawk finds the smaller shadow in a field. Edith, he said, effective immediately, you are removed from all family considerations, assets, trusts, participation in the company, and future distributions. Forks paused midair and then resumed their journey because money shocks some people but never stops their appetite. Stephanie gave a small gasp that wasn't surprise so much as performance. Thomas didn't bother to hide his smile. Victoria lifted her glass in my direction like she was offering a toast to a fallen opponent. Lucas said Dad and then swallowed the rest of whatever he almost dared. I looked at my father and noticed the way his knuckles whitened around crystal, the way he didn't blink, the way resolve sometimes looks exactly like fear. You've been making inquiries, he added, as if curiosity were a crime and integrity were insubordination. Approaching former employees. Pushing for information that doesn't concern you. I won't have it. There is a flavor to humiliation, metallic and thin, like you've bitten your tongue and pretended it's fine. I tasted it and set my glass down anyway, careful centered the way Mom used to place a book before turning a page. I didn't defend myself not because I lacked the words, but because defense accepts the premise. At that table, I was the only one who understood the difference between peacekeeping and peace. Thomas reached across to high-five Victoria like two kids who'd cut ahead in line. The chandelier's reflection trembled in my water and then stilled. I saw my mother in that stillness, her hand brushing crumbs into her palm, her mouth soft with patience. That was never passivity. Dad waited for me to cry or to beg or to accept my demotion like an adult child, grateful to keep a seat in the room. I did none of those things. The room heard only the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the hall and the careful clear of Teresa's throat from the doorway. I thought of the nights I'd sat in a midtown office with the city breathing outside the glass and numbers lining up under my hands like truth finally speaking. I thought of the emails that didn't add up, the deals that smelled off the way corruption wraps itself in etiquette and asks for another role. I thought of Mom's tea cooling on that coaster while she reread a paragraph until the meaning shone through. Family matters, Dad said to the room, and not to me, require loyalty, not interference. Thomas picked up the baton like a good first violin. Not everyone understands high-level strategy, he said, eyes never leaving my face. Victoria added, some of us give more than we take, and looked pleased with the sentence, as if she'd made it herself. Lucas's knee bounced under the table, broadcasting the kind of anxiety you only show when you still care what people think of you. I folded my napkin again straight line on straight line, because you either hold still or you break. Here is what injustice sounds like when you're old enough to have stopped expecting fairness. It sounds like your father using the word legacy as a weapon. It sounds like your siblings laughing softly not at a joke, but at gravity finally working in their favor. It sounds like your own breath steady and measured, refusing to speed up for anybody's performance. I should tell you that the house smelled like cedar and clove and the roast's peppered crust, and that it was beautiful. That's the thing about harm done in rich rooms, it leaves no visible bruise on the furniture. The bruise blooms under your blouse where no one sees, and you decide whether to touch it or to straighten your shoulders, and carry the dish into the kitchen yourself. I did neither. I sat and looked at my father and let time stack on time. Any questions Dad asked, and the way he said it sounded like the end of a quarterly report. I had 100, but none for this audience. I reached for my water, and in the goblet's surface, I saw snow draw white lines across the dark glass of the patio doors. The world outside kept falling in honest silence, while the table rehearsed gratitude for lies. Somewhere down the hall, the reading room waited, with its simple lamp and patient chair, the last place my mother's voice felt close enough to touch. I imagined the key turning, and dust lifting, and a page giving up its secret because I finally asked the right way. Dad sat. Conversation resumed like a river that had only paused for a fallen branch. Thomas whispered to Stephanie. Victoria took a picture of the place setting to capture the illusion. Lucas pushed his potatoes into patterns a child might make while pretending not to cry. Teresa slid a plate in front of me and touched the edge with 2 fingers, the way nurses check a pulse. Eat, her eyes said, and I heard Mom say, breathe. I breathed. I cut into the roast and tasted nothing. I counted the chandelier's prisms and old cracks in the ceiling we never fixed because they reminded Dad of a lean year victory. I let rage move through me like a winter front cold enough to keep my mind clear. I would not make a scene in a room designed to hide them. I would not explain myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. The toast ended the way verdicts do, with a clink, and the sound ran along the table like a silver fish. My father lifted his glass again and said something about prosperity, and the syllables landed neatly on plates that had never been hungry. I watched his face and saw the man who built an empire with his hands. And I saw the father who could not tell the difference between guarding a legacy and guarding his pride. I thought of the workers in the field office who wore second-hand coats and still showed up early on icy mornings because the job mattered. I thought of what inherited power expects and what earned responsibility requires. I chose the second one. Dessert arrived, a perfect lattice of sugared cranberries sparkling like frost. No one asked if I wanted coffee. I stood anyway and moved toward the sideboard where Teresa had left a small pot with a chipped mug that had somehow survived a dozen upgrades. The mug read, "World's okayest mom," and the fact that Dad never threw it out told me his grief was real, even when his judgment was not. I poured slowly and let the steam wash up into my face until I could smell something other than the evening's performance. "Edith," Dad said, not loud, not soft, and the room turned again because the room always turns when he speaks. I set down the pot and faced him across the stretch of mahogany we'd gathered around since I was old enough to reach the edge. His eyes were the blue they become when he's already decided. "You will not contact any employee, auditor, or board member about company business," he said, crisp as paper. "You will not access any internal system. You will not make this difficult." I felt the hurt rise like heat and pass through, leaving something harder. The injustice wasn't just the money or the title. It was the attempt to make truth an act of disloyalty. Mom would have smiled sadly at that and asked if we were done pretending. I didn't smile. I carried my coffee back to my chair and sat down, steady, quiet, my palm flat against the table's familiar grain. Snow tapped the windows like someone too polite to knock. Thomas started a new topic about Aspen. Victoria laughed and touched her hair. Lucas scrolled under the table with the blank concentration of a man searching for an exit in his pocket. I lifted the mug and felt the heat in my fingers and understood that something had shifted, and not just in me. Rooms hold memory, like lungs hold air, and this one knew what fairness felt like once. It would know again. When the cake was cut, I excused myself and walked the long hall toward the only door in that house that ever told me the truth. The reading room smelled faintly of lemon oil and winter, and a page waiting to be turned. I stood there with my hand on the knob, and listened to the party echo soft and distant behind me. Dad's voice rumbled, then paused. Silver clicked. Teresa's steps crossed tile and faded. I reached for the lamp and didn't turn it on yet. If you've ever felt the floor tilt under you at your own family table, you know the quiet that follows isn't empty. It fills with choices. On the other side of that door, mine were lining up patient and sharp as stars in clear January air. I took a breath, the kind you take before water closes over your head, and let it out slow. Behind me, the house performed prosperity. Ahead of me, the truth waited where Mom left it. I turned the knob and stepped into the reading room. The air carried a faint scent of cedar and old paper, like time itself had settled in layers on the shelves. The lamp on the small oak desk still held its shade slightly askew, just as my mother left it. Dust floated in the light like slow snow. For a long moment, I stood still, letting silence fill the space that used to hum with her presence. It was the only room in that house that had ever known gentleness. I sat in her armchair and ran my fingers along the worn leather tracing the small scratches from her wedding ring. A book lay open on the side table Willa Cather, the same one she'd been reading the month before she passed. The page marker was a pressed wildflower. I remembered her walking the fields behind the house picking those blooms, saying she liked how they lasted longer than people thought they would. When I opened the drawer beneath the desk, I found the faint outline of a key scratched into the wood. My breath caught. Walter's words from years ago floated back to me, something about my mother keeping certain things safe. I brushed away a layer of dust and pressed lightly on the wood. The panel shifted with a soft click. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a flash drive sealed in a small plastic case. The journal smelled faintly of lavender. My mother's handwriting, neat and sure, covered every page in flowing ink. Each line carried the rhythm of someone who had seen too much and still chose grace. I read the first entry, dated more than a decade ago. It spoke of her worry over Dad's blind trust in Thomas, her fear that ambition was devouring empathy. She mentioned me by name, how she hoped I'd keep my own compass when the family lost theirs. By the third entry, my throat tightened. She had noticed things long before I had discrepancies in company reports, whispered meetings between Thomas and Victoria, quiet manipulations that Dad waved off as harmless. If you're reading this one line, read, you are the only one left who still cares more about truth than comfort. I sat back, unable to breathe for a moment. The glow from the lamp turned the edges of each page golden, and the words seemed to hum with purpose. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. Folders opened scans of financial documents, email exchanges, copies of contracts. My mother had kept records of everything she suspected. The evidence was meticulous, and with it a small note in her handwriting. If the time comes, find Walter Jenkins. I stayed there until the fireplace clock struck midnight. The storm outside had thickened snow, tapping gently against the window panes. In the house beyond that door, laughter rose and fell around the dinner table, hollow as wind through empty halls. I knew then I couldn't stay silent anymore. Whatever had been buried here wasn't just deceit, it was rot spreading through everything my mother tried to preserve. The next morning, I called Walter's office. His secretary sounded surprised to hear from me, but she agreed to set a lunch appointment. When I arrived at the restaurant 2 days later, Walter was already seated near the window, a tumbler of scotch half finished in front of him. His hair had gone silver, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He smiled when he saw me, a kind of sad warmth behind it. "You've grown into your mother's poise," he said softly. I thanked him and slid into the booth. For a few moments we spoke about nothing, the weather, the holidays, the town. Then I opened my bag and placed the journal on the table. His hand froze midway to his drink. "She told me you might come one day," he murmured, voice low. "She said you'd know when the time was right." Was she protecting me, or the company, I asked. "Both," he replied. "Mostly you." Walter told me about the years after Mom's diagnosis, the quiet meetings they had to secure legal safeguards in case the others ever endangered the business. She'd created a trust in my name, one that granted me oversight powers hidden in fine print my father never bothered to read. She feared what favoritism would do, Walter said. She was right. I listened, every heartbeat pounding like a drum. The more he explained, the clearer the pattern became. My siblings using Dad's signature to secure loans, transferring funds under shell corporations, leveraging properties that technically no longer belonged to them. They're gambling with everything, Walter said. Your mother knew it would reach a breaking point. She wanted you to have the means to act when it did. I opened the envelope he handed me. Inside were legal documents bearing both my parents' signatures and a short letter from my mother dated the week before she died. Her handwriting trembled slightly but remained strong. The legacy of this family is more than profit. When conscience and ambition collide, choose conscience. The rest will follow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire in the hotel fireplace had died down to faint orange, but my mind burned bright. I made a list: names, numbers, possible allies. My expertise in finance gave me a starting point, but I would need someone who could trace digital footprints, someone who understood systems better than those who thought they were untouchable. I thought of Grace Chen, my college roommate turned cybersecurity analyst. Grace answered on the first ring. "You sound like a woman who's about to ruin someone's holiday," she joked after hearing the urgency in my voice. Maybe, I said quietly. Or maybe save a company. We met the next morning in her office overlooking midtown screens flickering like a city skyline. I showed her the documents. She scanned them quickly, eyes narrowing. "Your mother was brilliant," she said, "and paranoid in the best possible way." Over the next few hours, we pored over data. Grace located several suspicious accounts connected to names that didn't exist before last year. "Thomas is sloppy," she said. "He's using old shells but dressing them as new ones. I've seen cleaner work from interns." The humor was dry, but her focus was exacting. She found a chain leading from one of the company's subsidiaries to an offshore account in Grand Cayman. Thomas's name wasn't on it, but the initials matched his wife's maiden name. Victoria's fingerprints were everywhere too, loans tied to the company's properties, all filed under her boutique investment firm that had never produced a profit. And Lucas' sweet, reckless Lucas was quietly draining smaller accounts just enough to stay unnoticed. "It's like watching termites," Grace said. "You don't see the damage until the floor caves in." I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Every line confirmed what I already knew: this wasn't carelessness. It was betrayal, carefully built and beautifully disguised. "Can you pull records?" I asked. "Give me 48 hours, she said, "and a good reason to risk my license." "Family reason, good enough." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we're in business." 2 days later, we had a map, every transfer, every hidden signature, every date that aligned with one of Dad's business trips. Grace handed me a file thick with evidence. "You're sitting on a bomb," she warned. "Once this goes off, there's no pretending it's about misunderstanding." "I know," I said, "but it's not about revenge. It's about truth." I called Marcus Doyle next, a former FBI investigator turned private consultant. His voice was gravelly precise. "Financial crime inside families," he said, "always the hardest cases. No clean lines, only wounded ones." We met in a small cafe downtown. He wore a gray coat that looked older than I was and carried the calm of someone who'd seen people at their worst and kept faith in the law anyway. I gave him the folder. He nodded slowly. You'll need witnesses inside the company. Records are one thing. Testimony is another. Through Marcus, I found Daniel Wright, the former financial controller my brother had fired 6 months ago. Daniel agreed to meet after work at a coffee shop far from the business district. His nerves showed in the way he stirred his cup without drinking. I noticed payments that didn't make sense, he said. Consulting fees to companies that didn't consult. I reported it, and 3 days later, I was gone. He slid an envelope across the table. Copies of what I saved. I thought someone might need them someday. Each document he'd preserved fit perfectly into the puzzle. The theft wasn't an accident, it was an organized siphon. The realization settled over me like ice. My own family had built an empire on integrity, and now they were hollowing it out from within. That night, Grace and I spread everything across her kitchen table, documents, printouts, digital logs. Outside, snow blurred the skyline into watercolor. Inside, truth sharpened to a blade's edge. They're planning to sell assets next quarter, she said. At prices that'll look like losses, but funnel profits to those shells. If they pull it off, your dad takes the fall. My hands trembled slightly. He'd never believe me without proof. Then we'll get proof so solid he can't ignore it, she said. You have 6 weeks until year's end. Use the holiday gathering. I stared at the clock on her wall, ticking toward midnight. Christmas dinner. The same table where I was disinherited could become the place where everything came undone. I'll need help preparing, I said quietly. You'll have it, Grace replied. But be careful, Edith. People who steal family fortunes don't usually stop at money. Back at the hotel, I placed my mother's journal beside the window and watched the city lights scatter across the snow. Her words from that last entry echoed. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. I did now. I opened my laptop and began writing names: Marcus, Grace, Daniel. Tomorrow, I'd add one more: Sarah Patel, a young accountant who'd once sent me a nervous message about inconsistencies. Maybe she had seen more than she realized. Maybe she was waiting for someone to listen. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and soundless. Inside, I felt something return that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not vengeance, but resolve. The kind my mother carried when she looked a problem straight in the eye and decided what needed to be done. The house in Connecticut slept unaware. My father dreamed of legacy. My siblings dreamed of power. And I finally was awake. The morning light through the hotel window was pale and cold, softening the city into quiet silver. I sat at the small table, the journal open beside my coffee, its pages filled with my mother's handwriting. Her words steadied me as the plan took shape. 6 weeks until Christmas. 6 weeks to bring the truth into daylight without burning everything down. Grace called before sunrise, her voice brisk but warm. She'd traced new movements through the company accounts overnight, money shifting faster now, like they sensed someone watching. They're draining what's left, she said. If you wait too long, there may be nothing left to save. I promised I wouldn't. After we hung up, I booked a flight home to Connecticut. It felt less like returning and more like walking into a storm I'd been watching from miles away. When I arrived at the estate, the air smelled of pine and distant snow. Teresa met me at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at me with that same quiet kindness she used when I was a child trying to hide that I'd been crying. Your father's been keeping to his study, she said. Mr. Thomas visits almost every day. Always the same closed door. I nodded and handed her a small bag of gifts from New York. It felt good to give her something simple, uncalculated. I waited until the house settled into evening before calling Walter. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that steady calm I'd come to rely on. It's time, I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He only said, then we should meet. We met the next afternoon at his office, the fire low in the hearth behind him. He listened as I described what Grace and Marcus had uncovered, his eyes narrowing at the mention of offshore accounts and falsified signatures. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. "Your mother built more protections into her trust than I realized," he said. "Under certain conditions, fraud among family shareholders, for instance, you have legal authority to intervene." His words landed like the first real piece of solid ground beneath my feet. "Walter," I asked quietly, "if I act on this, I'll be turning the whole family upside down." He looked at me for a long time. "Then you'd only be setting it upright again." Later that night, I drove to a small diner outside town to meet Marcus and Grace. Snow had begun to fall, slow and deliberate, like the sky wanted to muffle the world. Marcus sat in the corner booth, coat still buttoned, and Grace had her laptop open beside a mug of untouched coffee. The three of us went over the plan piece by piece, secure evidence, freeze accounts, and bring the truth forward before they could destroy more. "You'll need one more person," Marcus said. "Someone still inside, close enough to see their next move." I told him about Sarah Patel, the young accountant who'd reached out months ago. The next day, I met Sarah in a small apartment above a bakery downtown. The air smelled faintly of sugar and yeast. She was nervous, her hands twisting the edge of her sweater. "I don't want to lose my job," she said, "but I can't keep pretending I don't see what's happening." I assured her no one would know her role. She handed me a flash drive and a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. "They make me reclassify transactions all the time," she said. "But last week, Thomas signed off on something big, an asset transfer scheduled for December 26th. My heart sank. They planned to move the money right after Christmas when no one would be watching. I thanked her and promised she'd be protected. As I walked back into the cold, the bakery lights glowed through the window, soft and golden. It struck me how some people carried courage quietly, like warmth you only notice when you're near it. Over the following weeks, the plan came together, piece by piece. Grace worked through encrypted servers and outdated security systems with quiet precision, her eyes flicking between screens as though she were playing an instrument only she could hear. Marcus compiled affidavits, timelines, and cross-referenced transfers until the pattern became undeniable. Walter drafted the legal documents that would give my mother's trust its full authority. Every evening we met in Grace's home office, coffee cooling beside us, the sound of the city humming through the walls. There were nights when exhaustion blurred everything. I would pause, rubbing my temples, and see my mother's face in my mind. The patient calm, the steady way she'd listen before offering advice. "When you feel small," she once told me, "remember who taught you to stand tall." Those words anchored me more than any evidence ever could. By mid-December, the evidence filled a single heavy folder. Bank statements, false invoices, records of wire transfers. Grace had built a secure trigger that could freeze the company's accounts instantly with one message. Walter had the legal papers sealed and ready. Marcus had arranged witness statements from Daniel and Sarah to be delivered to my father after the confrontation. Everything was ready except the moment itself. The night before Christmas Eve, I drove to the cemetery. Snow covered the ground in a thin white layer that glowed under the streetlights. My mother's headstone was simple, no grand marble, just her name and the words she had chosen: "Do what is right, not what is easy." I brushed the snow away from the letters and stood there for a long time, the cold biting through my gloves. "I hope I'm doing this the way you'd want," I whispered. "Not to hurt them, just to stop the hurt." The wind moved through the trees, soft and steady, and for a moment, it sounded like a sigh. When I returned to the estate on Christmas morning, the house looked like a postcard, ribbons on the staircase, music floating faintly from the parlor, the smell of cinnamon drifting through the air. Underneath it all, I felt tension running like an underground wire. I had never seen a house so beautiful and so brittle at once. Teresa greeted me with a hug. Merry Christmas. Miss Edith, she said, her eyes searching mine. I could tell she sensed the weight I carried, but didn't ask. She never did. Dinner's at 5, she added softly, and your father's been in a strange mood all morning. I nodded. It would be stranger soon. Upstairs, I changed into a simple navy dress. I watched snow slide down the window pane and felt the stillness before the storm. Downstairs, laughter floated faintly from the living room. Thomas's voice booming Victoria's polished laugh, Lucas's quieter echo. I took one last steadying breath and slipped my phone into my purse. Grace's text came through just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, system ready. One word, and it's done. At dinner, the family played their parts well. Dad at the head of the table, regal as ever. Thomas speaking with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Victoria charming everyone in sight. Lucas quieter than usual, eyes darting toward me once uncertain. I said little, watching, listening. Every smile felt like a mask, every toast rehearsed. When Dad rose to speak, I knew it was coming. His voice filled the room with practiced authority. Family and legacy, he said, raising his glass, two things built on loyalty. Then, as rehearsed in his mind but not mine, he turned toward me. And sometimes he added, we must remove what threatens both. The words hit the table like stones dropped into water. Thomas's smirk widened. Victoria's eyes glittered. Lucas shifted uneasily. Edith, Dad said you are hereby disinherited, effective immediately. The moment stretched silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. My pulse steadied. I reached for my phone and typed a single word, now. Within seconds, the message delivered and the storm began, though none of them knew it yet. I lifted my glass and met my father's eyes. Check your bank account, Dad. He frowned, puzzled, then glanced at his phone. The color drained from his face. This can't be right, he muttered. There's nothing here. He scrolled faster, confusion turning to panic. $12 million gone. The room froze. Thomas's smirk vanished. Victoria's hand trembled. Lucas looked between us, pale. My father's voice shook. What have you done? I rose slowly, my voice even. Nothing you didn't prepare me for. The accounts are frozen, not emptied. The evidence is ready to show who's been taking what isn't theirs. The chandelier light caught the edge of a tear on Victoria's cheek as she whispered, She's lying. Thomas's voice rose sharp and desperate, but I barely heard him. All I could see was my father's face, betrayal and disbelief woven together. I placed the folder on the table. The weight of it landed like finality. Merry Christmas, I said quietly. It's time to tell the truth. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel in the bones. My father looked from me to the papers, then to his children, the ones he'd trusted most. Somewhere deep in his eyes, I saw something shift. Something beginning to break open. He sank back into his chair without a word. His phone still in his hand, the screen reflecting numbers that no longer obeyed him. The snow outside pressed against the windows, like soft applause, steady and unrelenting. Inside, everything that had been hidden was about to come undone. My father's hand trembled as he scrolled through his phone, the blue glow washing over his face. I could see the disbelief rising like a tide he couldn't stop. One by one, the numbers he trusted vanished before his eyes. His mouth moved soundlessly at first, then the words broke out thin, sharp, frightened. This isn't possible, he whispered. Every account. All of them. He looked at me, eyes full of accusation. What have you done? Edith. The chandelier light flickered against the silver in his hair. My own voice felt steady, almost too calm. I haven't taken a single dollar, Dad. I've only stopped the bleeding. I turned the folder toward him. But you need to see who's been holding the knife. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the heating vents. Thomas's chair scraped against the hardwood as he stood, his voice cutting through the stillness. This is ridiculous, he snapped. She's staging some dramatic stunt to make herself look like a savior. It's a hack. She's probably been plotting this for months. I met his glare. Thomas, those accounts you used for consulting payments, they're registered to your wife's maiden name. Same pattern, same signatures. His jaw locked. You can't prove that? Yes, I said quietly, I can. I placed the printed statements on the table. The ink caught the light like wet paint. $6 million in redirected funds. Every transfer approved by you. He reached for the papers, but Walter Jenkins stepped forward from the doorway. I hadn't noticed him come in until then, but the presence of my mother's old lawyer filled the room with an authority that matched my father's. I wouldn't do that, Thomas Walter said evenly. These are certified copies. The originals are secured. Victoria's hand twitched toward her wine glass. This is all some misunderstanding, she said, her voice shaking at the edges. Those were legitimate investments? I opened another folder and slid it across the table. You used company properties as collateral for personal loans. $4 million worth. None of it repaid. The banks are expecting default next quarter. Victoria's painted nails tapped against the table before she folded her hands tightly in her lap. For once, she had nothing to say. I turned toward Lucas, who sat slumped in his chair, staring at the tablecloth. His voice was barely a whisper. What about me? I hesitated, softer now. $700,000 in falsified expense reports, gambling debts disguised as business entertainment. I have the receipts. He shut his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I didn't mean to ruin anything, he murmured. I just didn't know how to stop. My father's face had gone pale. The man who had always seemed unbreakable now looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He lowered his phone slowly, as if afraid it might burn his hand. You're lying, he said, almost to himself. All of you, you must be lying. Walter stepped forward, his voice quiet but steady. Sir, your wife anticipated something like this might one day occur. She took precautions. My father turned sharply. Elizabeth, what does she have to do with this? Walter placed a sealed envelope on the table. Everything, I'm afraid. My father opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were copies of my mother's handwritten notes and a clause from her will, one he had signed, but never read fully. As he scanned the page, his expression shifted from confusion to devastation. 30% of company shares transferred to Edith, with voting rights. Triggered only if fraud or misconduct threatened the company, Walter said. Your wife structured it that way to protect the legacy you built together. Thomas lunged to his feet. That's absurd! Mom never involved herself in legal affairs. Walter met his glare with unflinching calm. Your mother was far more involved than you realize. She documented your earliest attempts to divert company funds. She hoped you'd change before it came to this. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. My father's hands trembled against the table. Elizabeth knew, he said hoarsely, and she didn't tell me. She tried. Walter said gently, you wouldn't listen. My father sat back, staring at the papers, as if they might dissolve into air. The glow from the chandelier softened against his face, making him look suddenly older, almost fragile. How much, he asked, voice barely above a whisper, have they taken? I met his eyes. 14 million? And another 20 million at risk through their deals. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him like gravity itself. Then slowly he turned to his children. Why, he asked, was it not enough? The company, the homes, the trust funds, you had everything? Thomas looked away. Victoria stared at her wine. Lucas covered his face with both hands. None of them answered. I swallowed the ache in my throat. Because you gave them everything except accountability, I said quietly. They learned to take without consequence. They learned that love had a price tag. My father's gaze shifted to me, and for the first time, I saw understanding flicker behind the pain. And you, he asked, why do this after how I've treated you? The question hung in the air. My voice was calm when I finally answered. Because Mom trusted me to protect what she couldn't. Because this company feeds families, not just ours. Someone had to care enough to stop the damage. Walter cleared his throat softly. Mr. Thompson, I suggest we move quickly. Legal action will be necessary, though how public it becomes is your decision. My father nodded slowly, his spine straightening, as if reclaiming what little dignity he could. No police, he said after a long pause. Not yet. We'll handle it internally. But there will be consequences. He turned to Thomas first. You're removed from your position effective immediately. Your shares are restricted, your salary suspended. You'll repay every dollar you've stolen with interest. Thomas's jaw clenched. You can't do that. I just did, my father said, his voice regaining its old authority. Be grateful I'm giving you the chance to stay out of prison. He shifted his gaze to Victoria. You'll liquidate your assets to cover your debts. No more allowances. If you want stability, you'll earn it through actual work. Victoria's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Finally, my father looked at Lucas, his tone softening. You'll enter treatment again. This time, it won't be optional. When you return, there'll be a place for you in the Community Outreach Division entry level. You'll rebuild from there. Lucas nodded, tears falling freely now. I will, Dad. I promise. Then my father faced me. The room seemed to hold its breath. And you, he said, his voice quieter. In accordance with your mother's will and given your qualifications, I'm appointing you as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. I froze. Dad, I didn't do this for a position, I know, he interrupted. That's exactly why you deserve it. The chandelier light shimmered over the table, catching the reflection of the empty glasses, the crumpled napkins, the evidence of a family laid bare. For the first time in years, my father looked at me, not as a disappointment, but as an equal. He stood, signaling that the dinner and the deception was over. Everyone out, he said to my siblings. I'll speak with you after I've reviewed everything. Thomas started to argue, but one look from our father silenced him. One by one, they left the room. Victoria clutching her shawl like armor. Thomas moving stiffly, Lucas pausing at the door. I'm sorry, Edith, he whispered. His voice cracked on the words. I nodded, unable to speak. When the door finally closed, my father turned back to me. The anger had drained from his face, leaving only exhaustion and regret. Show me everything, he said. Walter joined us at the table as I spread out the documents, bank transfers, contracts, witness statements. My father listened without interruption, though every so often he'd rub his temples like he could push the headache away. When we finished, the clock struck midnight. The house was silent except for the faint hiss of the fireplace. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Your mother saw this coming, he said. I used to think she worried too much. She just saw clearly, I replied. That's what love does. He looked at me, then really looked, and nodded. Maybe it's time I learned that too. The glow of the fire reflected in his eyes as he reached for the photo that had sat for years on the mantel, a picture of Mom at my graduation, her arm around me, her smile bright and steady. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it gently on the table. She'd be proud of you, he said. I'm proud of you. The words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd stopped hoping to hear them. Now they landed with quiet finality, mending something I hadn't realized was still broken. Outside, snow drifted against the windows, soft and relentless. Inside, the firelight warmed the corners of the room where shadows once gathered. My father straightened the papers before him. Tomorrow we start cleaning this up, he said, together. For the first time, that word didn't sound like a demand. It sounded like a promise. The next morning came pale and quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a storm, when even the air seems unsure how to begin again. I stood by the window of my childhood room, watching soft snow gather on the hedges, each flake landing without sound. The house felt different now, not peaceful, not yet, but emptied of pretense, as if truth had opened every door and left them swinging. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clink of porcelain and Teresa moving through the kitchen. The scent of coffee drifted up the hall, warm and grounding. When I walked into my father's study, he was already there. Papers from the night before covered the desk edges, curling from the heat of the fire. He looked up as I entered. The exhaustion was still in his eyes, but so was something else. Clarity, maybe, or remorse finally finding room to breathe. He gestured toward the chair beside him. Sit, he said quietly. We have work to do. For the next few hours, we spoke not as adversaries, but as two people trying to rebuild something fragile. Walter arrived mid-morning with legal documents in his calm, deliberate presence. My father listened to every clause this time, reading each word with a patience that would have been unthinkable a year ago. When he finally signed the last page, he exhaled long and slow, as though surrender itself could be a kind of relief. I've spent my life building walls, he said, setting the pen down. I thought they protected us. All they really did was keep the wrong things in. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need confirmation. They only need space to settle. The days that followed moved quietly. My siblings signed their agreements in separate meetings. Thomas's face stayed hard and unreadable, but his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. Victoria arrived late, her perfume lingering in the hall, her eyes red-rimmed, though her smile never fully left. Lucas came last, shaking my hand before my father's, whispering a promise to do better. None of it felt triumphant, just necessary. That first week after the confrontation, the company headquarters felt like a different world. The glass walls and polished floors were the same, but the atmosphere had shifted: less tension, more breath. Employees, who had once avoided my father's direct line of sight, now greeted him without fear. In the meetings we held together, he deferred to my analysis, asking questions instead of giving commands. It was small, but it mattered. Change often begins that way, quietly, with a single tone of respect, where none existed before. I spent long evenings in the office, sorting through the wreckage contracts, reports, correspondence. Grace would call every few days to check in, her humor a steady tether. You sound like someone running a rescue operation, she teased once. I smiled into the phone. Maybe I am, I said, but not just for the company. In late January, we began the forensic audit that would stretch for months. Each discovery confirmed what we already knew, but also showed us how close the company had come to collapse. My father insisted on being present for every briefing. He took notes by hand, the old-fashioned way, and never left early. It wasn't pride that kept him there. It was penance, quiet and deliberate. By spring, the bleeding had stopped. The accounts stabilized debts, repaid credibility, slowly restored. Clients who'd once whispered about scandal began returning calls. At the quarterly meeting, the board voted unanimously to confirm me as Chief Operating Officer. My father remained as Chairman Emeritus, offering advice when asked and silence when wisdom required it. The moment felt less like victory and more like restoration, what my mother might have called balance returning to the house. Home changed too. Thomas moved to California to start his own small real estate venture. For all his arrogance, he had talent when he wasn't cutting corners. Sometimes he'd send short, stiff emails with updates on new projects, each one signed, "Regards, Thomas." It wasn't closeness, but it was effort. Victoria began volunteering at a community housing program our company funded. The first time I visited the site, she was kneeling beside a child, paint smudged on her sleeve, her laugh unguarded. She saw me, smiled, and said simply, "It feels good to do something real." Lucas, true to his word, went through treatment again. He now worked quietly in the outreach division, learning budgeting and mentoring at-risk youth. Every few weeks, he stopped by my office with coffee and stories about the people he helped. I could see the man he was trying to become, and it gave me hope. My father surprised everyone by stepping back completely that summer. He spent more time tending the rose garden my mother had loved, but he'd long ignored. Sometimes I'd see him through the window, pruning carefully the sunlight on his shoulders. We spoke often, but not about the past. Instead, our conversations were about things that grew, plants, people, possibilities. One afternoon in late autumn, I came home to find him waiting in the reading room. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and the old leather of my mother's chair. He held a small box in his hands. "For you," he said, voice rough with emotion. Inside was a silver key on a thin chain. "It's for this room. I've had it locked since she passed. I think it's time it belonged to you." I didn't try to speak. I only nodded and clasped the key in my palm. It was cool at first, then warm from my skin, as if carrying her memory in metal. My father smiled faintly. "Your mother would be proud," he said. "Not for what you saved, but for how you did it." That night, I unlocked the reading room for the first time in years. The lamp on the small desk flickered to life with a soft hum, spreading amber light across the shelves. Dust motes drifted like tiny lanterns in the glow. I placed the key beside my mother's journal and sat in her chair. The quiet felt sacred, not empty. I imagined her there, hands folded, watching the family she'd once feared would break, finally learning how to mend. Winter returned, gentle this time. Snow covered the grounds again, but it no longer felt cold to me. The company thrived under steady leadership. Employees spoke openly in meetings. Community projects grew stronger than profits alone. Life, I realized, was circling back to something my mother had always believed, that legacy isn't measured in numbers, but in the people you lift when things fall apart. On the anniversary of her passing, we gathered as a family at the house. The fire burned low in the great room, and for the first time in memory, laughter didn't sound forced. Thomas arrived late, carrying a small bouquet of white roses. He handed them to me awkwardly. "Mom's favorite," he said. Victoria brought a homemade pie. Lucas carried hot chocolate in a thermos, insisting it was for tradition. Even Dad smiled at that. We stood together in the snow afterward, the air filled with our breath and something lighter acceptance maybe, or forgiveness, finally quieting the noise. When they left, I lingered by the window. The snow fell in wide, soft flakes that seemed to slow the world. I thought about the year behind us, the lies exposed, the anger, the long nights of rebuilding. Every step had hurt, but pain had carved out space for something honest. Sometimes I realized you have to lose what you thought you wanted to understand what you truly need. Peace doesn't arrive with applause. It settles in like dusk, one shade at a time. I felt it then, the same way I used to feel my mother's hand rest lightly on my shoulder when she wanted me to stop worrying. As the lights dimmed, I walked upstairs to my office. The new sign on the door read simply, Edith Thompson, COO. I traced the letters once with my fingertip before turning off the light. From the hall, I could see the faint glow of the reading room down the corridor. It felt like the house itself was breathing again. Looking out over the snow-covered garden, I let out a long, steady breath. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding my ground against anyone. I was simply standing on it, secure, certain, free. Sometimes I thought justice isn't about punishment. It's about setting things right, and then letting peace take root where pain once lived. And as I watched the first light of dawn brush across the frozen lawn, I finally understood what my mother meant when she wrote, "Do what is right, not what is easy." If this story found a place in your heart, tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to stand up for what's right, I'd love to hear how it changed you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, family, and second chances. Because sometimes the real inheritance isn't wealth, it's peace, hard won, and the courage to keep it.